Good morning, everyone. My name is May Anas Villamin, your discussant at this moment, and my report is under Chapter 12, the European Model. Let us start to Europe as a highly regulated labor market. Germany is representative of the extensive regulation and employment protection of the European labor market. In Germany, unemployed workers qualify for unemployment insurance for 2 months and are not required to take jobs that necessitate their moving or that offer lower wages than they had earned previously. In Germany, the period of notice varies for the employer depending on the term of employment. The legal notice period for employees is 4 weeks and must serve so that it ends of the 15th day or the last day of any subsequent calendar month. The legal notice period for the employer increases with the length of the employee's service up to a maximum 7 months after 20 years of service. EU policy generally seeks to create a level playing field in labor markets, insofar as the European Union consists of high-wage and lower-wage countries. There has been concern that one country could attract employers away from other countries through less restrictive labor practices. As we take a look in Exhibit 12.2 offers excerpts from EU labor market regulations of work time, paid vacations, and work conditions. Member countries can offer even more generous provisions such as 35-hour work week in France, the 2 years of maternity leave available in Germany, and the provision to Swedish parents of 480 days off for each child at 80% of pay. Figure 12.6 provides measures of the degree of employment protection in an array of countries. It shows a distinctive pattern of lesser employment protection for the Anglo-Saxon countries, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, and the higher levels of employment protection for Europe, with South Europe and France among the highest. The few Asian countries for which the OECD has measures show an intermediate range of employment protection, although we do not know how strictly the law are enforced in these countries. And Figure 12.7 shows the number of hours worked per year per employed person in Anglo-Saxon, European, and Asian countries. The general trend has been toward fewer hours in Europe compared with the United States and other Anglo-Saxon countries. In 1980, workers in the United States, Germany, and France work about the same number of hours per year, on average 1,700 to 1,800. By 2001, U.S. workers still average about 1,800 hours per year, but French workers fall to slightly over 1,500 and German workers to well under 1,500 hours per year. German workers average about 80% of the hours of U.S. workers per year. Cost of labor market regulations. Labor market regulations cost output and jobs, but they have other costs as well. EU member countries must implement EU's labor regulations, including those that have less regulated labor markets such as the United Kingdom and Ireland. The cost of labor market regulations include not only compliance costs, but more importantly, the extra expense of fewer hours worked per week, generous paid vacations, maternity leaves, and regular unemployment benefits. Tax, wages, and labor allocation. Figure 12.8 and 12.9 show that employment protection, healthcare, social insurance, and state pensions are paid in the European model, primarily by taxes on labor. In the Anglo-Saxon model, Social Security taxes paid by the employee and employer account for smaller percentages of gross wages than in Europe. In Europe, Social Security contributions alone can account for 40% or more of gross wages, whereas in the United States they account for less than 13%. In Asia, Social Security contributions account for much less. Social Security and other taxes on labor introduce tax wages in the labor market. The tax wage is the difference between the wage received by the worker and the wage paid by the employer. As we take a look, the figure 12 shows how taxes on labor such as social security and non-tax compulsory payments raise the cost of labor and reduce the amount of employment and increase unemployment. The tax on labor causes less labor to be supplied as before. Workers base their supply on the net wage after the tax. The reduction in supply raises the wage and reduces employment. Both employer and employee share the incidence of the tax. In Figure 12.9 shows tax and non-tax compulsory payments as a percent of gross wages in the number of countries. In most countries, non-tax compulsory payments are only slightly lower than tax payments. It shows much higher payments on labor in Europe than in the United States or other Anglo-Saxon countries. Japanese and Korean payments are similar to those in the Anglo-Saxon countries. Public enterprise, nationalization, and privatization. The Anglo-Saxon model calls for a limited role of government and for protection of private property. The public enterprises should play only a minor part. Figure 9 show the greater amount of state ownership of enterprises in Europe than in Anglo-Saxon countries. Beginning in late 1981 and early 1982, Mitterrand announced a policy of nationalization, especially in the large industrial, trust, and banking sectors where state involvement was already substantial. The public sector share rose from 0 to 71% in iron, from 1 to 79% in iron and steel, from 16 to 66% in other metals, from 16 to 52% in basic chemicals, and from 0 to 75% in synthetic fibers. After the return of the Wheelies to power in the mid-1980s, there was a reversal in the trend toward nationalization and growth of the public sector, but the state ownership remains substantial relative to other countries. In the 1990s and early 2000s, discussion of nationalization was replaced by the discussion of privatization. The conversation on enterprises owned by the state into enterprises at least partially owned by the private owners. Wide-scale privatization was beginning in England under the Thatcher, who argued that private ownership would convert the massive bureaucratic and unprofitable public enterprises of Britain into profitable, well-managed companies. In Figure 12.10 confirms that there is more extensive public ownership in Europe, including Great Britain, than in the United States. Unions. Although union membership in the United States has fallen below 12% at the rapid growth of membership in public sector, unions have countered these trends. Of the 14.7 million U.S. labor union members, now a majority are public sector employees. The average union member is no longer the assembly line worker, but a school teacher or government employee. Giant unions such as the American Federation of Government Employees and the American Federation of State and Municipal Employees now represent the majority of American union members. Public employment. There is a big difference between the public enterprise and public employment. There are usually few public enterprises, but there can be a lot of public employment, such in schools, healthcare, and public services. Whereas the share of public enterprise has been falling, the share of public employment has been rising. In Figure 12.11 provides comparative data on the percent of public workers in the labor force. The rise in the share of unionized public workers helped prevent the decline in union membership in the United States. Higher rates of public employment help explain the higher rates of unionization in Europe. It reveals generally higher rates of public sector employment on the European continent, although Germany, Australia, and Spain have about equivalent rates to the United States and other Anglo-Saxon countries. However, none of the Anglo-Saxon countries have public sector employment shares close to Scandinavia, France, Netherlands, or Greece. Public employment shares are uniformly lower in the Asia, all well below 10%. Deregulation. The deregulation that began in the United States in the late 1970s and early 1980s was at least partially credited with the rejuvenation of U.S. economy after 1982. Thatcher's regulation of the British economy in the 1980s also appeared in the strengthened the British economy. In light of this success, the regulation became an official policy of the European Union. The regulation appeared as a necessary component of European industrial strategy toward previously regulated markets such as transportation, utilities, and banking, which had been characterized by state ownership in the 1980s. The limits of income security. The share of public employment is only one indicator of the role of the state. Figure 9.5 shows that the European countries have higher percentages of taxation and government spending than in the Anglo-Saxon or Asian worlds. These higher rates of government spending and taxation allow for a larger welfare state and a more interventionist role of the state. Arthur Okun used the analogy of a leaky bucket to characterize such as transfer. According to Okun's leaky bucket, as income is being transferred from one person to another, some of the income leaks from the leaky bucket, leaving less income for all. The reason for the leak is that those losing income in the transfer have less of an incentive to earn income, and the size of the income pie shrink accordingly. The European welfare state had its origins in Bismarck's Germany. Bismarck introduced public pensions and social insurance. He argued the state of all socialists receiving pensions, health care, and social insurance from the state rather than from private savings or private charity. Figure 12.12 shows government spending on social welfare as a percent of GDP. It reveals that the welfare state is most advanced in Northern and Central Europe, less prominent in the North America and Oceania, and virtually absent in Asia with the exception of Japan. The share of the welfare state of economic activity has been increasing inexorably over time between 1980 and 2005. Average European social spending rose by 6 percentage points of GDP. 6 percentage points of EU GDP equals slightly less than 1 trillion. Figure 12.13 shows how the elderly in the United States, Europe, and Asia pay quite different for their consumption. In the United States, those 65 and over combine labor income and private savings to pay for the bulk of their consumption. They continue to transfer income to the younger generation. Public transfers, mainly Social Security, pay for about a third of their consumption. Europe has quite a different pattern. The bulk of the consumption of people 65 years and older is paid for by transfers of the state. Sweden as case study. Sweden is a cautionary case study for the rest of Europe with respect of the limits of the welfare state. Sweden conducted the most ambitious experiment in transferring income and benefits from one group to another in the 1960s and 1970s. At the start of the experiment, Sweden, as a consequence of its extremely rapid growth over the previous half-century, was the world's fourth most affluent nation. By the time Sweden backed away from its Swedish model, it was the world's 16th most affluent country. Prior to its experimentation in the 1960s and 1970s, Sweden did not stand out relative to its European neighbors in terms of government activity, taxation, or economic policy. The looming democratic bomb. We see major differences between the Anglo-Saxon, European, and Asian models with respect to transfer of the state of the elderly and the poor. In the European model, social welfare is primarily assured by the state. In the Anglo-Saxon model, it is provided primarily by the state but with a healthy dose of private spending. In Asia, it is provided by the households themselves with little or no assistance from the state. Both Europe and the United States are bumping up against limits to the welfare states. With aging populations, population is aging much more rapidly in Europe than elsewhere. The burden of the welfare state on the state budget is intensifying. As the share of older citizens in the population rises and the share of working age population shrinks, the taxes collected on labor fall as a share of GDP and there is insufficient revenue to meet obligations to the retired. And last is the Euro crisis 2011. The notion of a single currency for multiple countries was first advanced by Nobel laureate Robert Mundell in 1961. Mundell, in his theoretical work on optimal currency zones, noted that the zone must have free labor mobility across countries, lack cultural barriers to movement such as different languages, have free capital mobility, and have price wage flexibility. At more practical level, the drafters of the euro understood that the single currency could be threatened by differences in its fiscal policy. If selected countries run large public deficits while others were fiscally disciplined, the creditworthiness of the entire eurozone could be questioned. These fears were shown to be justified in 2011. In 2011, a euro crisis broke out caused in large part by what were perceived as unsustainable deficit spending in Ireland, Greece, Portugal, and France, and Spain. These countries had been running large deficits well above the Stabilization Pact's 3% of GDP. And that's all for today. Thank you for listening.